Manufacturing Excellence webinar titled Getting Started, Vigorous Learning Organizations, the third and final webinar in the series on compression thinking. I'm Jerry Strohmeyer, the Education and Training Program Coordinator for AME, and I will be your moderator. Today's presenters are Robert Dackall, Jack Ward, and Monique Dumais. Dackall is the chairman of the Compression Institute and a 37-year veteran of Lean. He is a co-founder of AME and was the editor of Target Magazine for 22 years. Doc is the author of 2 books, Compression and Zero Inventories. Jack Ward is the vice president of the Compression Institute. He has extensive top executive experience with Melville Corporation and is a turnaround executive for several other companies. Monique Dumais is the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt and Kaizen Promotion Officer at Simmons Bedding. She has over 25 years in quality, technical, manufacturing, and engineering in several industries, including plastics, aerospace, food, and electronics for both military and commercial markets. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. You will see that you are muted on your attendee panel on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into your question area in the attendee panel and click on Submit. We'll review the questions at the end of today's presentation and answer as many as we can. When you log off today, please check your email inbox, and it will be an invitation and link to fill out a short webinar attendee survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey today, as your feedback is very important to us to improve future webinars. Our presenters have also graciously agreed to provide a PDF of today's presentation. We will be sending that along with a recorded link for a webinar replay to each of you next week. Now I am pleased to introduce Doc Hall, Jack Ward, and Monique Dumais, who will present Getting Started, Vigorous Learning Organizations. Take it away, Monique.
Thanks, Jerry Ann, and welcome everyone to our final webinar. Before we get started, I'd like just to review what we covered in the last webinar, which was webinar number 2. In slide 2, you'll see that we covered a few items talking about, in particular, factors that limited Lean in North America. And it really was looking at the differences between Lean practices and methods, and also the way management philosophies were in North America versus Japan. One of the key factors that we came away with there was that in North America, companies typically see people as things and not people. So that was one of the things that we learned on. That was a key factor of limiting Lean in North America. The scientific cleaning network we reviewed, and we talked about how the janitors were learning in their way, as well as how they came up with new ways of applying their jobs and how they applied new methods for cleaning materials and cleaning and using their jobs. And their jobs are important. Also, finite Earth. The Earth is not infinite, and there's a lot of resources that are limited. And then finally, we looked at principles of compression thinking, talked a little bit about the principles and how we can do more with less. So with that, I'll hand it over to Doc and Jack, and they'll start giving more details on compression thinking and vigorous learning. Doc, Jack?
Thanks, Monique. This slide 3, all the slides are numbered, and this one is sort of an overview of where we've been and where we may be going. There's way too much stuff here. We know you can't absorb this even in 3 webinars, and Jack will talk about that a little later in this. So this is kind of where we've been and then where we're going in this webinar. So particularly in webinar 2, we talked about the consequences of finite Earth. And there are a lot of interconnected problems, way too many. And if anything, the environmentalists have sort of understated them, and I'm not an environmentalist. But this is a very serious matter, probably the biggest one we have, if we could just digest that and get on with it. Once you've figured that out, the next question is, so what? And there are a number of approaches. One has been geoengineering. What big grand fix could we make to make all this go away? Others propose we ought to reduce the population without being terribly specific on what gruesome means might be used to get that done. Others are, there's enough stuff. All we have to have is the technology to go refine material that you find in lower and lower concentrations, and we'll keep going the way we are. And then one of the big ones is just denial. All this doesn't exist. So what? And our answer to so what, if there is one, is that we need to learn how to do better using much less. That's kind of bottom up, not top down. Not big conferences, not governments issuing regulations, some of which may help, but it doesn't. If those were successful, people would have to change what they do at the ground level anyway. And so if you take that premise and go on, you start thinking, well, what are some of the principles of thinking you'd need to do? Compression thinking principles. You start thinking about those, and it begins to shift your belief, especially about business. What's a business? What's it supposed to do? What do we consider waste? What do we consider success? And all that guides how your business may change and how you think about it. Then you get over to the far right-hand side of this, where I have the arrow now. We concluded that some of the best we've seen in lean companies may be a guideline for this. We call them creating vigorous learning laboratories, and that's what we'll concentrate on today, beginning with the importance of increasing the diversity of stakeholders addressed. Talk a little about leadership. This has to see the whole mission, rigorous systems of learning, and maybe the hardest one is behaviors for learning. And if we can do all that, will we have more effective lean organizations, that is, organizations capable of higher performance than most of us have thought about today. We're not re-showing the more complex performance index for an organization as you've seen in the last two webinars. This is a simplified view to kind of dig in. Down in the lower left-hand corner, you see proficient, and you go up to steps: proficient, vigorous, enduring. At the lower level, we called that a time or two mechanical lean, concentration on operational improvement. That's where a lot of lean companies are today. They've not really changed any basic concept of what the company is or what it should do or the business model, but they've become more efficient in delivery. There's a big gap between proficient and vigorous. Previous slide we had leadership for transformation there, and you see the blue arrow again. To get from that to the next higher levels, you need leaders that kind of understand where they're going, and at that vigorous level, can you create a learning system that almost runs itself? Certainly in their plants, that's almost what Toyota has, at least in their best plants. Don't need to be telling very many people what to do to get the work done today. And at the next higher level, that's getting outside the company and concentrating on long-term effectiveness of problems external to the company. And we've given two prior examples of people actually doing something like that. One was Seiki Sui, concentrating on residential housing, a very good, very well-built house done very fast, but more important, it should meet the needs of the residents of that house throughout a lifetime and be environmentally very compatible also. And another example was that cleaning network, where people concentrate not on just getting the job done, but on how you can use less stuff to create a much better cleaning outcome. If you look at the axes on this, cultural change on the horizontal axis here is from thinking about efficiency, which you don't stop doing, but thinking much more about how effective you are. And on the horizontal axis, can we expand the stakeholders? And that takes us to number 5. By the way, if you look at number 4 again, I'll go back there just a second. Can you peg kind of where you are now somewhere on these stair steps? But talking about the stakeholders, one of the stakeholders we mentioned was the environment. Good question is, who would speak for that at a meeting? In what way is it a stakeholder? But many companies think of stakeholders by what we have here labeled normal analysis. And they're 2 charts side by side. You can go out and Google stakeholder analysis and you can find a variety of these things, but these 2 charts are pretty much the core of a lot of what you'll see there. And the normal way of looking at it is, how can we influence others, thinking from your company inside out to accomplish some change we want to make, a new plant, new product line, whatever it is, usually a major change. And you can see you're looking for the high influence, high consequence people, and then how do you classify and deal with each of those stakeholders. You invert the analysis and you may start to conclude that people you've got, or stakeholders you really need to think about, are the ones that have low influence but high consequence. That's over in this box. This is a pretty important part of going on from concentrating on efficiency. It really begins to get into the job of the senior leadership of an organization. And some years back, I was privileged twice to be in a meeting with boards. These were informal meetings trying to decide who should become the next president of the company. These were medium-sized manufacturing companies. And in both cases, the VP of operations was very good, but was passed over pretty quickly. The reason was they had too little experience dealing with the externalities of the company, the advertising, the working with customers, some of whom may be happy and some of whom are not, dealing with the legal issues, dealing with people that may be upset in the community. And those were the kinds of things that, in one case, the lawyer for the company had handled very well, so they decided he's got the experience, he should be the next CEO. And that's how those things come about. Jack, you may have some experience on how German companies are organized a little differently to consider more stakeholders.
Yes, Doc. I spent about 18 years with the Melville Corporation, and my title was Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning. Also, I had the operational responsibility for All International. We were very successful as a company. We went from roughly $250 million up to $11 billion. Some names you might recognize are CVS Drugs, Marshall. And about 1989, a headhunter from Switzerland came and told me that I was the perfect guy for a company to lead a company that was in Germany. And of course, being blessed with all the success of Melville and taking that with me, I went to Germany and immediately found myself in the situation of not understanding the word diversity of stakeholders, because the German operation, or most of Northern Europe, work on 2 tiers, boards. One tier is the operational and maybe the owners. The company I went with was 110 years old at that time. The owners it was still a family-owned company, but had a supervisory board made up of stakeholders. And when you see the chart there that's in number 5, my first effort had to be how to figure out the stakeholders and what influence they had. And these stakeholders were the banks, the lawyers, the unions, Green Party, and the government, 3 or 4 levels of government. So I went there to bring them great views on how a successful American company worked, and finally learned a great deal about how a successful stakeholder-driven company works. Doc?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And that's good description of learning pretty quickly from a CEO's viewpoint. There are a lot of other viewpoints. If you're dealing with stakeholders, you'll find some of them that understand lean, which is in this part of this ball. You'll find quite a few that are interested in getting a return. That's investor thinking, financial thinking. You find a good many others. If you want to develop compression thinking, you have to pull in people that come from a different track, and this can get pretty splintered. And some of them have some very useful ideas. I would bet that in your companies you have some engineers that may be very advanced in DFX, design for everything. And they will, some of them swear that that is the one and only route to cure the environmental problems. And you can go around this and you'll come up with the same thing, because they all will have, you know, the ones with political thinking, well, what we need is to either combat the regulations, or we need to have better regulations, or whatever. And they may have a point. But if you're thinking, how do we get something done ground level and make some progress, the lean thinking is one of the better ones. And one of the hard ones is shaping the investor thinking, which, as we talked about last time, tends to think of the company as an asset to be bought and sold, and maybe everything in it is just an asset to be redeployed. That's very different from thinking of it as either anything environmental or as a group of people to be led. And that brings us to the Vigorous Learning organization. We like Vigorous Learning Laboratory. We're going to go through, as best we can in a short time, these 5 points. We've already discussed a little bit about leadership for learning. All kinds of leadership. Back in the 50s, I was exposed a couple of times to a little test on who should become a sergeant in the Army, an NCO. And nearly as I could tell, that depended on who could scream profanities the loudest. That's not leadership for learning. That's leadership for directing, no questions asked. Second part here, we call it seeing the whole, learning to synthesize, not just analyze, and learning to see a much bigger picture. We'll talk about the importance of having a common mission. We'll talk about rigorous learning systems, and if you're into a very far along as a lean company, this will be pretty familiar to you. And a little more time on behavior for learning, because that's the hard part. And in case we forget it later, down here at the bottom where it says continuous cultural reinforcement, you take this all together and you're cultivating the kind of a company that really expects people to behave in a way that most of us naturally would not behave. You know, a baby's first word may be mama, but probably its second phrase is not fair. And so we like to do win-lose games in companies and outside companies. If you're going to tamp that down with the culture of the company, there needs to be things built into it that are kind of warnings that, hey, you're not behaving the way we need here. So let's go on with each one of these. Leadership for vigorous learning. The beginning point in that is learn to ask the right questions. And maybe allocating time for learning how to ask the right questions. That's on your part as a leader. And try to set aside time for other people, anybody in the company, to learn to do the job better. If you're thinking lean, that's sometimes Jidoka time. Time to pull the cord, look at what we're doing, figure out what's going wrong or how to do it better. That in a factory is a part of it. But you can go on there, learning to mentor others, particularly in softer skills. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit more. The unfortunate part of being a senior leader anyway is removing obstacles, and you find in almost any company, if you're making a major change, somebody that you wish could come along just can't make the turn of Albuquerque, and sooner or later you have to do something to keep them from impeding the whole change process. And of course, everybody can set an example. The priorities at the bottom are straight out of a lot of training for military officers, which you may or may not like, but it's interesting. What's your top priority to get the mission done? What's the second one in the case of military? It's troops or stakeholders. And if you really get done, a distant third is me and my ego. This part, seeing the whole, this is one way to explain it is you're learning to sense the right questions to ask. And this gets into a good deal, synthesis and analysis. A lot of people do an analysis. You break things apart and you look at it and then maybe try to put it back together. Synthesis may be a little harder skill. And sometimes synthesis is accomplished more by things you sense than by anything that you can state very explicitly or maybe even put in an A3 report. It's asking you to see you and your company as part of a much bigger system, and that's what's described with these two balls. On the left-hand side, where I've got the arrow now, the way a lot of people would see the company is that the most important thing is it has to keep making money, so dollars come number one, and then if we're enlightened, why we really want to take care of people, and kind of an annoyance is all this environmental stuff. If you change that completely around, then you realize me and my company are just part of a much bigger world. And it's up to us to help ourselves and the people, the stakeholders, the people we deal with, to be resilient and if possible live well in a different kind of world, and then organize so that making money is almost like a specification of the business model. You design it in so that in a transactional world you got to take in more money than you spend, but it is not the objective. That's a huge transformation in value systems. I don't pretend that it's very easy for any of us to actually do in practice. The value of a common mission is that it unites people. It gives people a reason to come to work every day other than getting a paycheck. If you accomplish no more than that, it is a big gain in a good many companies. So the mission is a social reason to exist. That's different from a vision. Sometimes these terms are confused, but the mission way back when in the B school meant this is what the company does, and by implication a lot of things that it doesn't do, and if you're in a strategic conversation, it's nice to go back to that. The vision is where you want to be. Long term, maybe 2-3 years. Maybe it's 30 or 40, or maybe it's thinking this thing ought to be around for my grandchildren or beyond. But what's the long-term future aspired state? And then you do something pretty conventional, but bring that back and say, what do we start doing now? What are some actionable goals? Maybe 1 to 3 years out. Some of them may be projects, some of them may be initiatives for behavior change. Sometimes this is called backcasting. Where would we like to get to, and how do we backcast from that to things where we are that we can begin to do today to begin to take us in that direction? A rigorous learning system, you see there's 2 parts, and learning itself is a discipline. If you came from a collegiate background, you find a lot of kids come in and they really never have learned how to learn in a college setting, and so they have to learn that first. But scientific methods like PDCA, and there's DMAIC, and there's 8D and C4, and I don't know, several others. But the rigorous use of that is more important than exactly how it's stated. And it works pretty well for a lot of problems like you get in factories or in other operations. But when you get people that are in conflict, they can't see things the same way, you got to advance the dialogue methods of resolving problems and issues. Maybe if you call them issues. People can't even agree that the problem exists. And over here on the side is a rigorous record system. Everybody wants one designed for easy use, or it won't be used. But in any case, the discipline of using it is the key to its success. If you do not file your A3 papers, don't complete them, don't do them well, then nobody else can refer to them later. And that usually is kind of the hard step in getting that done. A little more time on this. For our well-done Vigorous Learning Laboratory, everybody needs to attain some level in these skills. And as a leader, what can you do? Well, start building learning into work, creating the expectation, creating a time for it, and maybe some things to do. And at least some clean companies today, an example is training within industries. And let's talk about just the job instruction part. Now, with job instruction, you're mostly training tasks. But even then, you got to identify the key points to emphasize the task for training. You've got to lay out what the steps are in doing the process. If it's something you know how to do and you've got to start from scratch, train somebody else in it. Then you got to think about who's being trained, what the setting of the training is, go through the 4 steps. And all that's not as easy as it looks. If you've done something like it, well, what does it do? It begins to change the attitude of people to each other. And when you're in a plant where people can train each other, you've got a little different atmosphere from one where, certainly from one where if one operator knows something and another one doesn't, they're going to hold that because now they've got one on them. Very different. Behavioral rules for meetings. There are all kinds of meetings, from stand-ups or morning stand-ups, which are pretty routine, to meetings of people that are practically strangers, and they have conflicts with each other. And now then, you need different rules for each one of those. But some fairly common rules, I think you can devise. You'll notice this little comment at the bottom, that if you start working with this in a company and you want to toughen the rules or codes, it's good to have a group of the people in the company themselves work that out in their language. It might be a tough pill, and it goes down a lot better if they devise it. I've seen that work a number of times. If the employees, the people doing the work, devise how they're going to operate, it's accepted much better. It takes longer, but it's accepted much better. In the long term, you're better off. One of the behavioral rules for meetings, and maybe one of the key ones, is some signal of violation. Like the middle of the meeting, somebody just says, this meeting going below the belt, meaning somebody in the room has been detected to have a hidden agenda, or they're doing a personal attack, or they're doing a sharp elbow on something. You're getting into personal conflicts. You're not concentrating on the meeting. I remember this was a big deal at Ventana Company, and you could sense the difference in the people of the company within about 10 minutes after talking with them. It just creates something different. The third one, the bottom ball where I've got the cursor now, that drive out here straight from Dr. Deming, here in 2 ways. One is fear of making a mistake. If you're going to learn something, you probably have to try something that may not work, so don't want to make real big mistakes, but don't fear making some small mistake. The second one is fear of speaking up or talking about it. And if you work with teams and you've got people starting out, you may have some that are so introverted that if they make an advance, they can at least look at your shoes while they're talking instead of their own. So this can be not as easy as it sounds. The next one over, mentoring. And to participate in meetings this way, you may need to talk to people individually, mentor on how they marshal facts, organize their observations so they know how, and they're not afraid of stating what they have seen or what they believe about something in a meeting. And that's a good chunk of what's in other contexts is called self-mastery. Need to attain the ability to keep yourself under control to do this well. And then the rules of dialogue are another one. We're going to go on to the next slide, which works on that. I've seen these in several forms. This is a cutback version of Bill Isaac's more or less original rules of dialogue. If you do need a cutback form, to start pretty easy when you begin working with this. First, listen to understand other people. The third one down says don't debate. Don't make this a debate. So you're not trying to promote your points and win-lose. This should come out, maybe not win-win, but how do we sense the wisdom of the group at first? How do we put together a picture of what a problem or an issue is, the perspectives that different participants have on it, and why they hold those? And so to do that, listen to understand, respect other people. You may think they're totally nuts, but respect them. And you may find that in some way they are a teacher for you. You discovered something you didn't know. Down to last, learning to voice your perspective, which is you clearly state it. You got to be prepared for a meeting, but you clearly state it, and you marshal the reasons why you think this way, or the evidence or the facts that support what you're saying. And don't try to advocate, just here's what it is. Kind of a beginning version of this is down at the bottom. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but it's lean coffee. Some of you have heard of this, and some of you may not have. And there's actually a sort of an official lean coffee organization, and you can get the rules, and about anybody can learn to run a lean coffee in about 5 minutes, I think. But shorthand is you use Post-it notes, and everybody at the meeting, no more than about 8, will put down one Post-it note, sometimes 2, with the topic they want to discuss for this meeting. You stick all those out on the table, and then everybody gets 2 votes, and you put a couple of dots. You can put 2 dots down on one topic, and you can put 1 on each of them, whichever comes out with the most dots is the topic you talk about. And you may have 1 topic per meeting, you might have 2, you might have 3, depending on how long. Each group has a moderator or leader, and then somebody that's a timer, so everybody doesn't talk too long, and everybody gets their time. That's enough. Go to leancoffee.org, and if you really get interested, well, you may find that a useful addition beginning like tomorrow. Well, we whistled through, and this is what we think at this point that we have covered. And so Jack's going to do a summary because he'll do a different way and take us out. Jack?
Okay. Again, we're back to a slide you saw in the beginning. And the importance of this slide is to really tell you the story that what you're looking at and what we're speaking about really has been evolved over probably the last 20 years by a number of practitioners, including Doc, under the guidance of Doc. There are many executives that have been involved, and we're all saying that there is a problem out there, and is there an art and science of managing messes? And you just have to look at your newspaper today, and you'll see the impact that's on you and your company. It really means that there are a lot of questions that the old and traditional approaches to management and to business models don't resolve. Hopefully, in the compression thinking principles, we give you concepts that are really, we'd like to have them concepts that will generate insight, innovation, and more important, action. And the practical part of it is, if you go over to the right side, is what we call the Vigorous Learning Lab. And underneath it are really a number of elements and skills that each of us would have to have, from the executive office right down to the shop floor or to any other part of the business. We are also using this model for nonprofits and communities that we're working with. But as you get to the bottom, please recognize that we're saying that if you're willing to take a look at the implications of lean and the tools of lean, you can become a very important part of developing a more resilient management technique for the 21st century. at this particular point, we have to really recognize that we can't do justice in just 3 hours of webinars. We're looking forward to establishing some vigorous learning labs, and you can go to our site about that. Now again, we're planning to have a live event in New England in around May 7th to the 8th. We will be setting up effectively. You can go to the Compression Institute's website and see that we're setting up these learning labs, and we'll be addressing in depth. These labs are somewhat different than a webinar in that they will be interactive. They will be long enough to get into some depth, not just the 30,000 foot view of compression and a business, but truly into how do we take this and make it an actionable method. As I said before, you can go to this, and please do go to our website, which you'll see in the back, and we have a newsletter that we generate out, that our group generates out, and we'll be addressing many of these points. Hopefully some of you, we have a limited amount of seats in the Vigorous Learning Lab, no more than 12, but you will be receiving 90 minutes of interactive work. You'll be receiving peer-to-peer, and we'll cover all the topics that we just discussed that are necessary skills. Again, as an executive over all my years, and by the way, also a past executive director of AME for a number of years, this has been a movement that Doc and I and a number of people would like to move forward. Again, Doc, when you put up our go-to, please, if you have any questions, go to this. And if you have any questions right now, this is the time. Again, we have to thank Doc and Monique. Doc is one of those resources that are hard to get. He is there because he was right in the middle of all that created lean. So he's a wealth of information, and we have a number of people that are also practitioners that are involved with the Compression Institute. Again, thank you for your time, and we have a great belief in the value of lean as being more than just a method or a tool, but being part of the solution of the problems we're seeing today in business. Monique?
Okay, this is Jerry. Is it time for questions now, Jack?
Time for questions.
Okay.
On the last slide, that addresses where you can go to our website and find out more about the dialogue series. But just go to our website and you'll dig out for it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack and Doc and Monique. And now we will review any questions. So if you do have any questions, please submit them on the right side of your screen, and I'll read them. We have one that is there a way to use the vigorous learning concepts to increase employee engagement?
I'd say it's all about increasing employee engagement from the get-go. Because if you go around all the stuff we've talked about, behaviors for learning, that is it. If they are engaged, if they're really engaged, they are beginning to ask questions. The leaders lead by asking questions, and the responsibility is on them. Now, in any work organization, you've got to have a means for assigning a responsibility. But the really good ones have a learning organization where people share a lot. So I can rattle on, but I'm not sure where to go from there.
Just one other thing, Doc. This is Jack. Really, a vigorous learning organization the whole concept is to have people thinking and learning together. And you set up a vigorous learning unit based on a particular problem, but you make sure it's highly diversified. So you're really engaging people totally in the concept. We certainly go around and creating a dialogue, getting perspective. One of the key problems when you're trying to manage a mess out there is the fact that, do you know the problem? Did you define the problem? And have you tapped into the experts that are in-house and the people that are closest to the problem? That's getting people engaged from an executive's point of view. The next question.
Okay, great. Where do you recommend leadership of an organization to start for vigorous learning, and what groups should learn this first?
Well, it brings up two things. If you wanted to do this and you're not in the senior leadership, so probably if you can persuade that senior group to just let you set up a little discussion group and then begin to talk it around and then draw them into it, maybe it will trickle up, so to speak. If you are in senior leadership, you begin with you, because you need to think it through on what you're trying to do and the behaviors you're trying to set for people. You know, are you ready to lead this effort? That's the beginning point. And then once you're through that, which may take a while or may not take any time at all, set up a learning group in the company. By the way, we used to do that early 80s when there wasn't anything to read about what we now call lean, so that what we did know about it, people, the leaders of the company, that is department heads and so on, the way they were organized then, everybody talked about this maybe once a week for an hour or two for a couple, 3 months to make sure that everybody kind of understood it and our heads were screwed on straight before you went out and started working with people on the floor. So that's some precedent for it. We beginning with little vigorous learning groups, and then you just begin to expand the practice and then begin to think of things that you can change to make the moves from there.
Maybe one other item from an executive's point of view. In my experience and the challenges I've been faced and with different companies, the first thing you have to do is get the executive group together and have them do self-reflection. What are their assumptions? What are their definition of the problem that or challenge that they're being faced? And it may only take a 2-hour episode with them because they're pretty clever. And then ask them if they believe that their people have the answer. If they're looking out and saying, I can get the answer from them, and I have to tap into them, and I have to look at my employees and the experts in-house as really the ultimate answer. They can come up, my job is to come up with the right question and make sure that they work on that question and give them the resources that's necessary.
Okay, Jack, you remind me at the beginning of the Scanlon plan when Carl Frost, who was a clinical psychologist, this was on gain sharing and all the things implied by that, like 5-6 decades ago. He would meet executives on neutral turf. He would describe what was involved, and he'd give them some stuff to look at. And then he'd ask them 2 questions. Write a paragraph or 2 on their future aspiration for them personally, another paragraph or 2 on their aspiration for what their company could become. And he might reject it the first time around. And when he saw that they had come around and their attitude and their idea made them receptive to really making the changes in policies and procedures that made gain sharing workable, he said, I think you're ready now. Sounds simple, but I don't know how you pull it off.
Doc, one of the tools I use both in Europe and in the United States was the value stream map. Became a tool for at the executive level. And as very much like you run a Kaizen, you get people at that level to start thinking about it and on one sheet of paper put that together. So leadership has to make the first choice, and that is, do I want to just be measuring and forcing the productivity, or do I want to meet the goals and mission of our company?
Great. And I think, Jack, you had answered, and maybe, Doc, if there's any more to this, but our next question, which was, how do you engage the senior leadership team who controls the purse strings? So I know, Jack, you had, provided a couple of suggestions on engaging the senior leaders. Might there be anything else that you can think of?
I guess it's, go ahead, Doc, I'm sorry. Interrupting you.
Well, if you happen to be in a company where the management just will not be receptive to anything, it's kind of up the creek. But provided they are, then figure out how you can have somebody else meet, go to them, begin to advance the proposal, and most important, draw them into a conversation about it until they kind of understand what this is about. Most of them have sense enough not to jump off a cliff. And so don't expect magic. You've got to draw them in.
Okay.
Jack?
Yeah, I know we're moving along on the time. I think really the key is that even if you're at the lower level and you have the idea of moving your company into a more advanced stage of lean, if you talk to the executives and come in, and listen to what they believe. If you just ask them, what is the problem right now in your mind? Okay. And who else in the company could help define that problem? Because a lot of problems at the executive level are not clear-cut. They're not production problems where you have a lathe that's going erratic. They're really at the problems of involvement with the outside world, and ask them how they define their company as a system. What's inside of it? What's outside of it? What's arm's distance in terms of the environment, in terms of regulation? They'll start looking at it slightly different. I mean, I've done this on the back of a napkin sitting in a hotel dining room in Switzerland to a board. And they're pretty clever. Once they see that they can solve the problem, and you can give them some examples of companies that have been successful with vigorous learning, in whatever name you want to call it, they're looking for a technique that will help them. The other part of it is that they have to be willing and open-minded, and some of that time, that takes time on your part in answering their questions back. But really listen to them as they define the problem.
Okay, great. Thanks. Now, on the other spectrum, can we expect some groups or people to resist compression thinking or vigorous learning? If so, how should leadership handle this resistance?
I think we're back. This is Jack. What I would do, and classically with mergers and acquisitions you do, is you do a stakeholders analysis. Who are the people that you identify clearly, who are the people that we need, who are the people that are going to be obstacles, who are the people that are going to be the buy-in, and then you define, as we gave you that chart before, how you manage them. Do you have to give them the information? Do you have to go through it? There are some people that are just going to be blocking, but you have to still manage them. The key thing with the word management is that you're managing these problems. not managing production. You're managing these problems in the relationships. And I think that's one of the aspects. That particular matrix that Doc put up, very important, because it's really management of stakeholders.
Okay.
Will be perfect. I remember this one Japanese manager I talked with about his work with a supplier to Toyota, and bringing the people around to really being engaged in lean. And he said, if after a couple of 3 years you have 1/3 of them that are really enthused, 1/3 of them that will go along, and the last third just don't object, you probably have a big win. The world's not a perfect place.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Here's another question. What are the basic keys to success in influencing and affecting others?
Anybody can ask a question, nobody else can answer, I think.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know that there is any magic key. I think Jack hit it in his last discussion, that influencing others means figuring out how what you're proposing to them will affect or influence or improve the problems and issues that concern them. It's figuring out how you get on the same side of the table with the other party that's key. And that, I don't think it makes much difference whether that's the leader of the union or the leader of the company. How do you get them into a conversation so that the same thing will put them in effect on the same side of the table? And you got to appeal to their interest to do it.
Okay.
One of the elements we talked about was a dialogue. And that's very important in terms of influencing people. And I found, and really there's a great deal of write-ups on it in operational research and other areas, that the first thing you have to do to influence people is to listen to what they think. Second thing is walk your talk. People will not necessarily agree with you, but they would like to understand that they've been heard. And that's consistently and we're back to the Kimber walk. If you're walking and you're reinforcing that you're open-minded enough to listen to their suggestions, you can influence them. And people of influence are there. I've met people of influence in any company that I've walked into, and they can be a janitor, or they could be the president of the company, or they could be the matriarch of a 104-year-old company who probably had more wisdom in her little finger than most of the executives that I was trying to change. Again, influence is in the person, is in integrity, and it's really walking your talk and not just espousing it. The one great failing, walking down and espouse whatever the fad of the month is in terms of management school techniques, is the fact that the average Joe can look at you and know if you really mean it. When it comes down to the push, comes to shove, do you follow it through? Do you make sure it's balanced? If you espouse being lean, are you doing it throughout the company? Are you getting the production and still not changing the way marketing sells all their merchandise at the end of the season and wants to have an inventory when you're going to zero inventory? Your job is to keep that relationship between all the activities in the company in balance against the ultimate view of what the company is. Russell Akoff once said, you know, your company is a social economic system. Like a car, individual parts can work. Your carburetor can be the greatest in the world. transmission can be the greatest in the world. But if they don't relate to each other, that car will not be a transportation of human beings and safely transporting. Again, that sense that you're there orchestrating rather than telling them all the answers is really an important factor. I find by asking people, tell me how to do that, how you would do that, is more important than telling them what to do, particularly if you're the president or the managing director if you're in a European company.
Okay, great ideas. Thank you. Thank you both. One more question. What tools do you recommend to tie into the vision and goals to bring this all together?
That's back I think the question refers to backcasting.
Oh, the backcast.
Yeah, I'm
yes.
not quite sure what the questioner is, which part he's picking off here. But if you got a vision way out there, and you are, that's what I'm relating it to anyway, was that backcasting part. Yeah, there are pencil and paper techniques to kind of do that. So if you can figure out where you'd like to get to, and backcasting means, can you kind of imagine in your mind some stages you might go through as a company getting from here to there, and from that come back to a beginning stage. So I've done that with a few companies on not exactly this, but strategic planning, where, you know, what they had to do was a pretty big transformation. Okay, where are you now, and where would you like to be, and can you imagine what a stage before that where you would like to be would look like, and then the stage before that, and the stage before that. So if you can kind of picture, it may be a little vague, but if you can picture that in your mind and kind of write out something in a box, I think it helps that backcasting logic. Now, what do we need to do that would take us to stage 2 or stage 3 by the end of year 1 or 2, or, you know, that kind of strategic doodling.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you Jack, Doc, and Monique for a very insightful presentation and a great webinar series on compression thinking. This brings our webinar and series to a close. Our next webinar will be on Friday, April 17th on Reshoring, Don't Go Lean Without It with Harry Mosier. Please visit AME.org under the AME Events and Training tab for more information and to register. And don't forget to fill out the short survey that will be in your inbox. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a productive day.